By the end of the film, we hope that you will be prepared to begin participating in revolutionary activity yourself.
People seem to be very eager to imagine, both historically and presently, that the aristocratic class is just a parasite on society. It's not enough for me to just say here that the rich have not taken anything away from you. I think it's really necessary for me to add the rich give a great deal to help the poor, even in the United States of America. We're not talking about Denmark here. We're not talking about Sweden. We're not talking about Singapore or Japan. Look at this chart. Who pays the taxes? Who pays to make all of the good things in American society possible? Who pays to transfer their wealth and income to help the poor? It's the rich. It's the rich who pay for the poor. It's the rich who pay for the sewage system and the hospitals and all the wonderful government services that taxes bring. It is the rich who are paying for food stamps. It's blindingly obvious, okay? The top 1% of the population alone are paying 24.2% of the taxes in the United States of America. The United States of America, as you know it, would collapse. The government would cease to exist. Everything you assume about life, the existence of roads and electricity, would be impossible without the richest of the rich paying that money in taxes. Look at that, 81st to 99th percentiles, 44.6%. If you add those two together, it is blindingly obvious the important positive role that the rich have in American society. Now, what measurable difference does that make for the poorest of the poor? This little bar chart from the Congressional Budget Office, this is from the United States government, this little bar chart is showing you the poorest 20% of people in America. The green bar is showing their income before transfers and taxes. So their income before the government takes some away in taxes and gives them some in benefits. And then the purple bar shows you the income of the poor after transfers and taxes. Okay? The poorest 20% of Americans, their wealth is more than doubled. Just look at the size of the two bars. They may be small, but the poorest 20% of people in the United States of America benefit massively from the generosity of the rich, specifically the money paid in taxes that is redistributed to them. And this is not paradise, this is not Japan, this is not Denmark, this is the capitalist United States of America. Oh, and look at this. This is the fourth quintile. So out of the 5 segments of society, if you split society into 5 segments, 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, the fourth quintile, these will be people like affluent doctors, optometrists, architects. These are wealthy people, but not fabulously wealthy people. Okay? The fourth quintile, look at that. The bars are almost exactly the same. When you look at how much money they pay in taxes and the benefits they get from the government, it's only a tiny, tiny difference. They're giving up just a little bit of money. So who's paying? Who's paying to more than double the welfare of the poorest of the poor? There it is. It's the top 1% and it's the highest quintile. Just as the two blue segments of the pie chart made obvious before, it is not the case that the wealthy of the United States of America play no positive role in your daily life. On the contrary, they are underwriting the society you live in, the paving of the roads, the provision of electricity, water, heating, you name it, to an extent you can hardly fathom here and now. If you think that the existence of your education system would be better by liquidating those two blue parts of the pie chart, no. Maybe you can start to imagine why it is that communist societies overall seem to have decimated their wealth once the revolution is over and done with.
Revolution is serious business, and it requires serious study and consideration. But after you have familiarized yourself with the concepts which we are about to present, We trust that you will be well on your way to waging revolution against the tyranny of capitalist oppression, which grips us all.
There are those who say that the best way to do away with capitalism is gradually, over time, through reform. By voting for anti-capitalist candidates and working through the legislative process, communists can slowly but surely implement laws and regulations that weaken capitalism and strengthen the working class. At least in theory. Reformists are skeptical that revolution is even achievable at all in the real world, and they see revolution as an unrealistic and unachievable fantasy. Reform is also not enough. Marx and Engels touched on reformist socialism when they discussed bourgeois socialism in the Communist Manifesto, writing, "This form of socialism by no means understands abolition of the bourgeois relations of production, an abolition that can be effected only by a revolution." Rosa Luxemburg further elaborated on the need for revolution in her 1899 pamphlet, Social Reform or Revolution. Reformists do not really choose a more tranquil, calmer, and slower road to the same goal, but a different goal. Our program becomes not the realization of socialism, but the reform of capitalism. Not the suppression of the wage labor system, but the diminution of exploitation. That is, the suppression of the abuses of capitalism instead of suppression of capitalism itself. The only way to do away with the brutal system of capitalism once and for all was to dismantle it completely, which calls for revolution. What is revolution? Revolution is, quite simply, the replacement of one system with another system entirely.
I think it's tremendously important to clarify this point. Revolutions change who rules. They don't change what is being ruled. They don't change the economic or political system. In the history of ancient Rome, there are numerous revolutions. What do we mean when we say that there was a revolution in ancient Rome? A group of people, very often starting with a patrician house, with a group of aristocrats, nobility, conspire and lead a revolution and take over the government. They change who rules. Now, also in the history of Rome, there sometimes were revolutions from below. There was fighting in the streets, and the plebs, the commoners, sometimes the slaves. There were slave revolutions too. Pleb revolutions, slave revolutions. They rose up and they changed who rules. But changing the person who sits on the throne or changing the people who sit in the Senate is very, very different from the type of promise being made here. And note how vague and how entirely negative the promises being made here are.
Where reform seeks to alter and change a system in order to improve it, revolution relies on abandoning a system entirely to erect a new one in its place.
It's deceptively simple to promise abandoning a system. In Russia, after 1917, did they abandon the system of where cow milk came from? Did they look at farming and agriculture and say, oh, capitalist production of milk is bad and evil and wrong, let's abandon it? No. Milk and meat and wheat and bread were all produced in exactly the same way. They didn't have a new system to actually produce anything. Do you think they suddenly said, hey, we have a new system of producing cars. We have a new system of producing bullets and rifles, the material they needed for war? No. They could neither abandon the system of production they already had for these things the government relied on. The government relied on food. The government also relied on explosives and war material and so on, right? They couldn't abandon anything of the kind. They could only take over a system that already existed. They could change the people who ruled. A new dictatorship could rise up and take over the government. Okay? Now, in another sense, very literally, when you look at the seats of power, when you have revolutions, including communist revolutions, but not only communist revolutions, you have a parliament. What happens when there's a revolution and new people take over? Maybe they literally erase the word parliament and replace it with a word like the hall of the people, the Great Hall of the People, the People's Congress. Maybe they come with a new name for it. The fact remains, there is a building with chairs, and the people who sit in those chairs have power, and you don't. The population doesn't. The population is still ruled by somebody. Then you look through the other sectors of the economy, the farms and the factories. They're still ruled by someone. There has been no change in management in principle. The only change is in who is the manager. What's changed is ownership. There are new owners. There are new bosses. The actual system of production, the actual system of social organization is the same. And it's not just Lenin who struggled with this, and it's not just Stalin who struggled with this. Hilariously, Mao Zedong, when he got to the end of his life, he was an old man, he complained about this also, that he had signed up for this revolution and he thought everything was going to profoundly change. But he complained as an old man, the only thing that has changed is ownership. Now, instead of it being owned by capitalists, these same things were owned and operated by the state.
Think of your car's engine. If your car won't start, hopefully it's just a small problem. A bad spark plug, a loose belt, that sort of thing. If the engine is in good shape except for a bad part here or there, your mechanic can reform the engine by replacing the broken part with a new one. But what if it's a major problem? What if the engine is in such bad shape that it would be more time-consuming and expensive to fix it part by part? Sometimes it's a better option to just replace the entire engine.
Even if that were true, it doesn't mean that you have access to a technology that is fundamentally superior to the internal combustion engine. If your car breaks down and you replace the engine, you're going to replace it with another engine that obeys the same laws of physics, that accomplishes the same task. It may be 5% more efficient, or it may be 5% less efficient. But it's an illusion to suggest that just because you are replacing the engine, that the act of replacement itself means that things will be fundamentally different or better. That's exactly what a dishonest used car salesman would tell you, yeah? One engine is a little bit different from another. But the act of replacement doesn't entail that you have some fundamentally superior technology that's much better for the environment or that's going to get you to work faster. These are the types of misconceptions and it's the misplaced optimism that communist revolutionaries are playing on. If you think that state ownership in an authoritarian sense, or even collective ownership in a so-called, anarcho-communist sense, if you think that's fundamentally better, why don't you take a look at American Indian reservations? Why don't you take a look at the difference between a casino that's owned and operated by a for-profit corporation and a casino that is owned by all the members of a tribe that answers to a tribal council? You have collective ownership, community ownership. How different are they really? Ultimately, there's a board of directors, there's a manager, there's some kind of hierarchy for management. In one case, ultimately, the management answers to the shareholders as part of a for-profit corporation. In the other case, the casino operates and it answers to a tribal council and it has to produce a profit for those tribal people. There are some differences. Maybe it's 5% different, maybe it's 10% different. But nobody who even does a cursory bit of research into this, nobody would think, wow, Las Vegas, Nevada would be fundamentally transformed for the better if you took away the ownership of the casinos from private corporations and gave it to the community. That's already been tried. That's already a reality in the real world here and now. You see it on Indian reservations, and in practice, it resembles corporate ownership 95%.
An automobile or a cellular phone is a good bit less complex than human society. However, these examples do demonstrate that reforming a system is only a viable long-term solution when the system itself is adequately designed. A system can only be reformed if it is worthy of reform.
You should notice that the argument here is being made entirely in terms of claims about how bad the system is that's to be replaced, and not the quality of the system that would replace it. The claims are just being made that the car engine is broken. There seems to be no onus on them to prove that they have a technology that is fundamentally superior to the car engine.
If a system is inherently unfair, if power is distributed unevenly, if reformist potential is severely curtailed, then revolution becomes the only viable long-term solution.
Whether we're talking about the management of a factory, the management of a coal mine, or the management of the House of Parliament, the Senate, the elite level of decision-making in the government itself, really ask yourself, what will change when new people take over through a revolution? What is going to change at the coal mine? What will change is who is in charge, not how they manage, not even the motivations for why they will make the decisions they make. It happens fairly often in capitalist democracies that a group of workers will take over the ownership of a company when the company is going out of business, or even just when the original owners or original shareholders decide that they want to retire, that they want to quit, they want to do something else with their money. When that happens, so let's say stereotypically there's a factory that's going to go out of business, and the owners say, okay, look, we're contractually obliged to pay out to all of the employees several $1 million in some kind of severance or settlement now as part of the act of going to business. And then some party steps in, some outside party steps in and says, wait. If all the workers agree, we can take this settlement money, we can take these severance packages, and we can invest it back into the company. And in effect, there can be a kind of hostile takeover where the employees take over ownership of the company and it remains open. It keeps functioning under new management. But nothing really changes. When workers do this, it's obviously because they want to keep doing their jobs rather than taking the payout. And by the way, there will never be enough money just from the severance itself for that to happen. Some other quote-unquote angel investor will come in. The investment might stereotypically come from, some retirement savings plan. There's some pension plan that decides, okay, they can put some tens of millions of dollars into keeping this factory open, partly on a for-profit basis and partly on a charitable basis, whatever. And the workers invest this money, and there's still an office, there's still a manager, there's still a boss, and that boss is still motivated by maximizing profit. They're still trying to make money. They still fire people for being incompetent. They still hire new people because they think they can help them make more money. They still make changes. They still make executive decisions like executives in a capitalist system in much the same way. And here we're just talking about the workers taking over the means of production within a capitalist system. The tragedy of the so-called utopian experiments in communism all over the world, whether it was on the scale of a small plot farm or on a huge scale, factories, mines, a whole society, the tragedy is that this same pattern plays out again and again and again. You have new people sitting in parliament, you have new people sitting in the manager's office, but fundamentally, nothing much changes. And part of the problem is exactly that these revolutionary proposals are just stated in negative ways. They just talk about abolishing and getting rid of capitalism. Okay, well, when you get rid of the shareholders and replace them with public ownership, how different is it really? Within the United States of America today, look at a government-owned prison and a prison owned by a private for-profit company. How different are they really? There are some differences. I think you can actually look at the prison system, private sector versus public sector, and you can come to conclusions about which one is doing a better job, which one pays its employees better, which one treats inmates better. There are some differences. But if you think you're looking at a dramatic night and day difference between the private sector operating something and the public sector operating something, you're living in a kind of fantasy land. And reciprocally with that, when you look at the disasters of companies that get taken over and run by the private non-for-profit sector, when you look at what happens for example, in the history of the Soviet Union or the history of China, when the government decides they can do a better job running the steel industry than private investors can, there were certainly reasons to pause here and question, wait. How strong is this analogy that the engine in the car is broken? And even if the engine in the car is broken, shouldn't we face up to the fact that we're really just going to replace it with another engine of the same kind? Shouldn't we be cognizant that finding a fault in the engine is something very different from a blueprint for a fundamentally new way to generate electricity or generate motion within the hood of that car?
Capitalism is an inherently and irredeemably flawed system, as we can see from the incredible wealth disparity that exists in capitalist states around the world.
This argument is just an appeal to jealousy. Wealth inequality is not the same as injustice. The fact that someone is more beautiful than you, someone like Maddie Limburner, who we've just seen on screen, you may never be as beautiful as her, you may never be as fit as her, you may never be as wealthy as her, you may never have a kitchen that looks that nice or that opulent in your life. That doesn't mean that she ever did anything to harm you. That doesn't mean that she ever did anything to wrong you. That doesn't mean that she ever took anything away from you. Now, broadly, in the history of Europe, you're talking about a situation where capitalism emerged after feudalism, where the fundamental wealth inequalities were created by the fact that aristocrats owned the land and peasants did not. Simplifying history a little bit, let's not get into details. If you come from Canada or the United States or Australia, it's more extreme because it's a history of slavery and genocide and colonial appropriation of land very rapidly, kicking all the people off the land. And the people who ended up owning the land, they formed the wealthy class. They formed the ruling class. That's a problem. And there's a way to solve it that hasn't changed since Aristotle. If ownership of land is unequal and unfair, you can redistribute the ownership of land. If access to education is unfair, you can, in effect, redistribute access to education. If access to medical care is unfair, you can redistribute access to medical care. All of these things can be changed. But that's not the argument he's making here. The argument he's making here is that wealth inequality, the fact that some people are richer than you, is itself an injustice so deep, it's eliciting your sense of jealousy, that somehow the existence of that wealth out of your reach is a crime against you, it somehow harms you, and therefore you have to rise up in revolution and destroy the whole system. I think that is fundamentally evil as well as being misleading and false, because this revolution is not promising to take that money away from the rich people and give it to you. The only thing the communists are offering, and the only thing even the socialists are offering, is to take that money away from the rich and for it to be kept by the state. The people who are a little bit more anarchist in flavor, the anarcho-communists, they will tell you that the wealth will be owned by the community or by everyone. I used to live in Canada. There was a community swimming pool. Who do you think owned it? It was owned by the state. It was owned and operated by the state, and powerful people in government, not me, decided when it would open and when it would close and who could go inside and who couldn't and how much money I'd have to pay to go inside. I was in absolutely no sense an owner of that swimming pool. Even though it was owned by everyone, it was owned by the community, it was owned and operated by the state. If you just pause and think, that swimming pool, public swimming pool, how different is it really from a private for-profit attraction like Disneyland? I'll tell you how it's different. If something is unpopular at Disneyland, they have to respond. They have to change it really quickly. If Disneyland opens a new exhibit, a new ride, a new attraction, and it's unpopular, they respond very, very quickly to public perception, public interest. They respond to their shareholders too, yes, and new management will be assigned, and people will get fired and reshuffled, and new executives will take over, and there will be a new attraction put up as quick as can possibly be. And when something works poorly in the public sector, if you don't have a very transparent democracy, if you don't have a system that really allows members of the public to come in and complain and say, no, this swimming pool is being badly run, or it's corrupt, or there's something wrong with this, it's very, very hard to get any change. Why did Sega go out of business? I mean, any of these companies you see, it happens around us all the time. It's part of the norm in capitalism to such an extent that you can learn to ignore it. All the time, private for-profit companies respond to public interest. They're incredibly sensitive, right? Then it's all rooted in the profit motive, but it's also rooted in, if you like, the people-pleasing behavior, the crowd-pleasing behavior that's built into the capitalist for-profit system. And the contrast to that is the fundamentally bureaucratic, fundamentally authoritarian, fundamentally oppressive behavior of state-owned, government-owned public entities. Okay? Now, I'm not a libertarian. I think there are all sorts of things in our society that can and should be owned by the government. I'm fine with the government owning hospitals. I'm fine with the government owning prisons. I'm completely happy that the government owns sewage treatment plants, and most of the time the government even owns the pipes that takes the sewage away from your house, and there's another set of pipes that bring clean drinking water to your house, and the government owns the pump house, and the government owns and operates the electricity generating power station. It's a wonder, all of the things that the public sector owns and operates that are owned and operated by the government. Okay? And I think it's very important to have a transparent and accountable democracy to prevent that part of the economy from becoming kleptocratic, from becoming corrupt and evil and abusive. Okay? But the discourse we're being presented with here is fundamentally appealing to your jealous instincts. It's telling you that it doesn't matter how well the system runs. It doesn't matter how well the whole government system runs in Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, Japan. Doesn't matter. Because as long as there's somebody better off than you, as long as there's somebody prettier than you, as long as there's somebody wealthier than you, if you feel jealousy, you'll feel that somehow what they have was taken away from you. And you now want to use the revolution and the power of the state to take it back. But the sad thing is about the communists, they'll never take it back. They'll never give it back to you. They'll take it, and then they'll keep it for themselves. It'll become government property. It'll become the property of a totalitarian, dictatorial, communist state. And the promises of the anarcho-capitalists, they're only as different from that as what you see with tribal self-government on an Indian reservation, where basically a corporation with a manager and a board of trustees operates a casino in the name of the community, in the name of the people. But it functions much the same way as any other private for-profit entity.
The only way to completely topple this unjust and self-preserving system is through revolution. But how do we have a revolution in a capitalist state where the government has nearly limitless power? How can a small group of revolutionaries ever hope to challenge the globe-spanning empires of exploitation which exist under capitalism? It does seem daunting.
The issue of plausibility matters in another peculiar sense. I said to someone the other day, look, these revolutions you guys are caught up on, you must recognize that far less than 1% of the population of the United States would support a Nazi revolution, Nazis coming to power and taking over the government of the United States. Far less than 1%. Okay? And not just that, a huge percentage of the population would be very strongly opposed to this. Okay? By the same token, it's not just the problem that less than 1% of people would support this kind of communist takeover of the government, but the well-informed opposition to it, millions and millions of people, The number of people who would say, no, I'm not just opposed to that on the level of voting against it in a referendum, but if there were an attempt to take over the government, if there were a coup d'etat by communists, that they know what that means, they know what the consequences would be, and that they would rise up and they would fight against it to preserve democracy, preserve freedom of speech, however it is you want to think of what it is they want to preserve in this society. They would be willing to stand up and die fighting against that communist dictatorship. And communists watching this video, if that's hard for you to imagine, think about how you would feel if there were the threat of fascists, of Nazis taking over the government. You would say the same thing. You'd say, you don't just want to sit there, or you don't just want to vote in a referendum. You're suddenly galvanized to such an extent that you're willing to fight against a coup d'etat. You're willing to fight to restore democracy and to restore freedom of speech and all these other things, because you know how terrible the consequences are of allowing a fascist dictatorship to take over the government. Well, those of us who study the history of communism, we know also just how terrible the consequences are if we allow a communist dictatorship, a dictatorship of the proletariat, to take over the government. We know how valuable it is to preserve our democracy, however flawed. We know how important it is to preserve democracy in principle, even in a flawed system. There was an episode from history that really moved me emotionally when I read it the first time. And it came from one of the smaller islands off the south coast of Korea. So there's North Korea, South Korea, and then there were islands south of Korea. And a group of refugees had arrived on this island. This is kind of during the Civil War period. Refugees who were running away from the horror of what communism was in what became North Korea. And they arrived on this island, and when they got there were completely idealistic, completely naive university students who wanted to support communism and who wanted to have a revolution on that small island. And the refugees who were there and who had endured, they had seen the horror of the gulag. They had seen the reality of what communist revolution created in North Korea, and they probably also knew about what was going on in Mao Zedong's China, in communist China further north, because it's just not that far away. They knew how terrible communism in practice really was. And those people, those refugees on that island, with no guidance from the government, with no army support, they rose up and fought on the streets, and they killed people. They said no, they were willing to fight to the death against these communists to prevent this from happening again in South Korea, to prevent this from happening on that island. And you can imagine the misperception of the two sides, because those communists on those islands, they weren't like secret agents working for the North. They weren't really cynical, clued up people. They probably were just idealistic students who heard this same kind of bullshit that you're hearing now on YouTube, promising them a better world and saying the system is broken, with these vague promises of liberation and negation of everything that's wrong with the capitalist system. But that's the thing about democracy. Democracy is ultimately not just a popularity contest. It deals with hard choices between things that are factually correct and factually incorrect, decisions that are right and wrong. Ultimately, democracies have to set up sewage systems that will prevent human beings from having cholera. That involves technical, scientific facts, not just a show of hands for what 51% of people want to do with the budget to cope with the sewage system. Hard, terrible facts. And that creates both rational and irrational inequality. Because when it comes to making decisions about how the sewage system should operate, how the education system should operate, how the healthcare system should operate, there are people in the population who know, and there are people in the population who do not know what they're talking about. And that's one of the inequalities democracy has had to struggle to cope with since Aristotle in ancient Athens. Hey, since the democracy in ancient Athens voted to have Socrates put to death. Those people in South Korea, they weren't just a division between left and right, between idealistic university students and refugees. Ultimately, there was a distinction there between people who know and people who do not know.